I'm Margaret Benefiel, and I'm the Executive Director of the Shalem Institute for Spiritual Formation. And it's my privilege to introduce Dr. Wendy M. Wright, who is Professor Emerita at Creighton University, and she's also an author and spiritual director and retreat leader. And she will be our Gerald May Seminar retreat leader and speaker this year. Wendy, I'd like to ask you, what do Francis de Sales and Jane de Chantal, two people you'll be talking about, have to say about living contemplatively in a time of pandemic?
Well, we're all learning as we go along, aren't we? But having worked on Francis de Sales and Jane de Chantal for many, many years, it is of interest to me to think about this question. The first thing I would think about is Francis is known as a man of great gentleness, depth, and also a great deal, people tend to be consoled by his approach to things. And there's a wonderful kind of famous quote that comes from one of his letters that he wrote to one of his directees. Do not think what will happen tomorrow, for the same eternal Father who takes care of you today will look out for you always. Either he will keep you from evil, or he will give you invincible courage to endure it. Now, on the surface, when I started thinking about this question of this time, which is so unsettling, really, and that's the first thing you think about with Francis, is this sense of remaining in peace, ridding your imagination of what troubles you. However, it's not his approach, and that of Jane, his confrere, great spiritual friend, is not really one that is naive. You will notice that he says either God will keep you from evil or he will give you invincible courage to endure it. He was a realist. He was also a person who took seriously in his day the rather new at that point, this is the beginning of the 17th century, explorations in science, and was very much convinced that human reason and human ingenuity and human capacity was given to us to live well in the world. And so he was not a magical thinker in the sense of, oh, God will just save us from everything. But he was very well aware that we should use our human ingenuity and the knowledge that we have as human beings to try to deal with the problems that are here. And I remembered reading many years ago, this is after Francis's death, that when Jane de Chantal was Mother Superior of a convent in Annecy, there were other religious communities that she had founded that were scattered around France. And there was a plague in the 1630s. And as a matter of fact, it went on and off for a couple of years. And she writes really interesting letters to her community in which she is describing what they're doing. Basically, without using the term, they're doing social distancing. They are very aware of closing off the convent from people going in and out. They are also very aware of the cost of that. There was one of the monasteries that was in the city of Autun, which is particularly hard hit. Cities often are densely populated and plagues tend to flourish there. And the sisters in the community were starving because, as were many of the other citizens, because the people in the countryside who grew the food were not able and were afraid to come into the town itself. And so Jane did arrange for a sheep. One of her daughters, who had married quite well, lived near Autun, and one of the sheep from the castle that she lived in was driven then across the countryside, kind of from pasture to pasture by, kind of getting different people, keeping distance, and into the monastery gardens eventually, so that the women would have something there to eat. So just the fascination of learning about what they were doing, but also in the middle of that, she describes the community as being very tranquil. In other words, they had this very commonsensical approach to things. When there's a plague, you don't pass it to other people, and you use social distance. You do all the things that you can to keep it from spreading further. And yet they never blamed God for this or saw it as a punishment. It's part of what is, part of the created world is this. They didn't have ideas of viruses in the way that we do, but they did live with the consequences of these, and they lived with it thoughtfully and carefully, and yet also with a sense that God will give the courage to endure this and to deal with this. So I was fascinated to think about that with these wonderful historical figures who are so commonsensical and yet also such deeply contemplative folks.